Thank you. We've got an absolutely amazing panel following what I think was a terrific and very rich panel with lots of questions, some unanswered challenges, but we must proceed, and we've got an exceedingly tight schedule here. But we're delighted to have Dr. Michael Nacht join us, keynoting this particular panel on deterrence, something that he is no stranger to, both within the halls of academia and inside government. Dr. Nacht joined the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for GSA from the University of UC Berkeley, UC Berkeley, where he oversaw and was Dean of the Goldman School, which has got perhaps the most preeminent reputation for public policy. He has served 3 times inside government in various capacities, all of which are relevant to the topic at hand, and currently is overseeing not just cyber and space policy, but also nuclear, WMD, and we're absolutely delighted, Dr. Nacht, that you've taken the time to join us here. He will give a keynote and take some Q&A immediately, and then we're going to go to the panelists. Dr. Nacht, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's very good to be with you. I wish I could be with you the whole day. I'd learned a lot. But I often wondered when government officials come in and out of these meetings just to give a speech, are they just being rude or just being pompous? No, they just have to run to meetings. So we have a very short amount of time, and my 7-hour Castro-like speech has been telescoped into 12 minutes. This is about cyber deterrence capabilities. So you discussed the threat this morning. I'm only going to just say a few words about it, and then also cite the Georgian example from which we may learn something, but we'll see how valid an analogy that is for our future problems. And then I'll discuss how we're organizing ourselves in the Defense Department to deal with these really pressing, challenging issues. So first on the threat, I mean, this is a very well-informed, sophisticated group. So we cluster the threats in the familiar way that the community is clustering them. That we have nation states, particularly peer competitors, and then others who are developing very substantial cyber capabilities that could really do a lot of damage to us and are doing some damage to us already. We have a variety of sub-national groups, including terrorist organizations, that are using cyber very creatively at the tactical and at the communications level and sometimes at the strategic level. We have criminal organizations that are in it for the dollars. And we have hackers and hacksters and patriotic hackers, those who are connected to states and are themselves also showing a lot of creativity. And just to make life more complex, we have combinations across all 4 categories. So there's a lot of collaboration. So this is a really difficult and growing array of threats, besides what it is they're doing, which is a whole separate spectrum. I'm not going to discuss that today. You all know the centrality of the attribution problem in cyber. It's very difficult. It makes a lot of the normal ideas about deterrence weaker or less applicable than they were in the nuclear area. But that doesn't mean that some of the deterrence ideas are not applicable. It also doesn't mean that the attribution problem is hopeless. We're trying very hard to make inroads on attribution. We're making some progress. It's very tough. But we have a long way to go, and the offense is doing a lot of things to make our life more difficult. So let me stand back from that very brief discussion of the threat and say, what would one do to deter a cyber threat in this complex environment? Partly if you really knew who it was, and even if you don't really know who it is, but maybe you have some ideas who it is, or you think you know about groups who are associated with those who are doing what you don't want them to do. First of all, you could threaten them directly, right? You could, if you really knew, you could threaten the potential adversary, and you could say if this continues, we're going to respond in a very credible way that's going to be very damaging to you. We could threaten associates, networks, others connected to who we think the threat is, and hope that we catch the bad guys in the course of the threat. We could just do a great job successfully defending our capabilities to demonstrate that it's not in their interest to keep attacking because we can stop them if we had such capabilities. So a great defense could actually begin, if not to deter, then at least perhaps to dissuade. We could gain more and more exploitation of what they're doing, what they're planning to do, and maybe tell them what we know about what they're doing, or maybe tell them a little bit about what we know what they're doing. Again, just to say, you're not getting a free ride here. We could actually demonstrate some ability to retaliate, to do to them what they're doing to us. To say, this really is not going to be a free ride for you. We could react, if we knew something about the source, in domains other than space. We could react in economic terms, in energy terms, in political diplomatic terms, in space. We don't have to limit our sense of threatened or actual retaliation to the cyber domain. We could formulate explicit declaratory policies of the United States government about cyber attack, what constitutes a hostile act, what constitutes use of force. We could do that. When we meet with major leaders and meet with sub-state actor heads, we could raise the issue. We could talk directly with them about it. We could try to reach bilateral agreements with other governments on how to collaborate against the cyber attack. We could try to form international cooperative agreements, even treaties, norms or codes of conduct. These are all future possible actions for the most part. We could have special activities to reassure our allies. What is it we can do for them that can reassure them about the cyber threat? NATO, for example, is developing a cyber capability now in the last few years. Every one of these virtually involves huge legal, political, and sometimes even ethical questions. And we have to be very sensitive to what we do to ensure that we're not in any way seen in our actions or in our statements as infringing on civil liberties, infringing on privacy, that we're being as transparent as we can be, so we're not brought down by criticisms, maybe even well-intentioned criticisms of our own activities. So this is some very initial thinking about how one approaches this problem of deterrence, and not just of deterrence, but of the Schelling term compellence, to try to persuade folks to stop people from doing what they're doing, or coercive diplomacy. There are a family of concepts related to but distinct from deterrence that might be applicable in the cyber realm. Now those are some sort of conceptual ideas. When you bring it down to the reality of the real world, you see how complicated it gets. I assume this community is probably very familiar with this August report, the U.S. Cyber Consequence Unit report on the Georgia attack by Russia. For those of you who are not, let me just cite their summary conclusions of the nature of the attack. And it really highlights immediately the complexity of what we're dealing with here. They had about 4 major conclusions, and then a lot of other details, which I won't go into. First, the cyber attacks against Georgian targets were carried out by civilians with little or no direct involvement on the part of the Russian government or military. The organizers of the cyber attacks had advance notice of Russian military intentions and they were tipped off about the timing of the Russian military operation while these operations were being carried out. So they may not have been connected, but they were well informed. Social networks operating over the internet were the main tool used to recruit those carrying out the attacks. And the civilian cyber attackers were aided and supported in their efforts by Russian organized criminal elements. Finally, actually there's a fifth one. The total number of individual civilian cyber attackers involved in the campaign against Georgia, total number of civilian cyber attackers, was much greater than the campaign against Estonia, which you heard about this morning. But the total number of computers involved was much smaller. So you start thinking of how to deter such a complex network involving civilians who were connected but not part of the Russian military, civilians, kids sitting in internet cafes in Moscow know about Russian military operations, not normally. Civilians who know about these operations, who are also connected to criminal elements. It is really a vastly difficult set of problems. And maybe what will happen tomorrow will be quite different in tone and character than what's happening today. So what to do? Capabilities, what to do about all this? Well, the Defense Department has been studying this problem for quite some time, quite a few years in fact. And the essence of the studies has been consolidate your capabilities. That's been the bottom line. You have too many disparate capabilities. They're scattered, they don't talk to each other, they're doing pieces of the job. Some are doing exploitation, some are doing defense, some are doing other things. We need an organized, coherent, centralized capability. These studies have said, and we now know because we're living with it every day, the threat is very serious. It ranges from disturbances of our capabilities to actually modifying our capabilities, the threat to modify what we have. It would be unconscionable for us to permit that our own capabilities for low-intensity conflict, for conventional operations, for standard conventional warfare, for potential use of missile defenses, and for strategic nuclear weapons to actually malfunction as a result of these capabilities. We cannot possibly permit that to happen. So we must do everything we can to prevent it. And I would say in my own area, I have 5 areas of responsibility: countering weapons of mass destruction and proliferation, nuclear policy, including the Nuclear Posture Review, missile defense, including the Missile Defense Review, space policy, and cyber. I have little doubt that the slope of the curve of change of cyber is by far the greatest. The slope of the curve is like this. I like to say at the start of the Obama administration, we're in preschool. By the end of 4 years, we'll be in graduate school. And who knows where we'll be 8 and 10 years from now. There's tremendous growth of capability. So what has happened? Well, after a lot of toing and froing, as this community knows, the Secretary of Defense has approved the establishment of a sub-unified command, the Cyber Command. So, we're organized among a group of combatant commanders. The STRATCOM, Strategic Command, headed in Omaha, Fort Offutt Air Force Base. STRATCOM will now have at its disposal, the Secretary at his disposal, a sub-unified command reporting to General Chilton, and that will be Cyber Command. It will physically not be in Nebraska. It will be here. It will be at Fort Meade. It will be co-located with the National Security Agency, but it will be separate from the National Security Agency. It will have its own buildings, its own staff, its own budgets, its own oversight mechanisms. There'll be crosstalk, of course, between Cyber Command and the intelligence community, but NSA will have no role in overseeing the Cyber Command. It will be the same individual, if our plans are correct, who will be the head of the Cyber Command, but this is yet to be determined by a congressional confirmation hearing. The Subunified Command's job is to plan, coordinate, integrate, synchronize, and conduct activities to direct operations and defense of Department of Defense information networks. You know, as we know, there are three broad categories of networks. There's .com, .gov, and .mil. We are in defense, are in the .mil protection business. We're not in the .com protection business. We're not in the .gov protection business, except as we are asked to help the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies in the White House who will be in charge of the .gov protection. We have major challenges in addition to attribution. We have to have a mix of exploitation and defense capabilities and active defense capabilities. We have to develop policy guidance so we know what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. We have to inform the Congress on a regular and transparent basis of what we're doing. There are many supporters in Congress of this activity. There are skeptics. There are critics. There's the press, the think tank community, the broader public. And as we know from the last number of years, there have been some very serious arguments and problems and debates about how much of this we should be doing. We have to make very clear what it is we're doing and what it is we're not doing and develop the capabilities to do that. We're in the earliest stages. This is a review that took place just over the last number of months. The Obama administration has only been in office 9 months. Most of the political types have been in office 6 months or less. And we're first now about to stand up the Cyber Command, so we don't have a lot of answers yet. We do have some core questions, though, for the Cyber Command coming out of policy. And it is our job, I should say, and I'm going to end on this because I've already gone too long. We have 3 jobs: to develop the policy guidance for Cyber Command, the policy guidance for the Department of Defense, which exceeds Cyber Command and includes intelligence and defensive capabilities, and represent the department in the interagency discussions about a national cyber strategy, which will be more accelerated once our cyber coordinator is named and in place, which, as you know, has been delayed for some time. Core questions we're wrestling with in our job at the moment: if we have to operate at net speed to protect our networks, what new operational concepts do we require? What is the nature of the DoD policy framework, the new policy framework that's required? What are the distinctions and thresholds among cyber crime, cyber espionage, and cyber national security events? How do we differentiate? What new legislation or directions by the President of the United States are required to protect our DoD forces from cyber threats? What is the nature, what explicitly is the nature of our new declaratory policy on cyber self-defense? What else do we require to maintain our mission for DoD in terms of having critical capabilities to defend against attack? And from all of those policy questions then, what are the resources, manpower, education, training, equipment? What is required for Cyber Command to best ensure the operation and defense of DoD networks? These are all the issues we're beginning to wrestle with now. It's a huge set of problems. We need your help. And I'd love to see you in the Pentagon to talk more about this. But I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Secretary Nacht, thank you so much. If I understand correctly, you have a couple minutes to entertain some questions. I might also note, as a original co-founder of International Security, I would like to see academia and some of the other policy journals spend a little more time addressing some of these issues.
I think that's coming. We saw General Clark had a piece in Foreign Affairs. Mostly the community's been talking to itself, but now I think it'll be broadened to the larger international security community and then to others. I also know there's a prominent international relations theorist, Nazli Shukri. She's at MIT, and she's written a book on the implication of cyber for international politics. So I think, when I was in academia, I like to say academia leads and government follows, but we know that's not true. So academia tends to follow. So now that the world is happening with cyber, academia is going to come on board. There'll be more articles than you'll know what to do with, I'm sure.
Good. Please, Suzanne, and then please identify yourself.
I was struck by your remark about the complete unacceptability of certain kinds of degradation, which intuitively makes sense. You must do everything you can to prevent it. I wonder, though, it sounds a lot like the kind of risk elimination versus risk management that we saw, that we've seen since 9/11 in terms of cannot allow another attack
Right.
sort of approach, and which clearly has implications. And one of the implications, aside from the implications for privacy and civil liberties and where it stands for priorities, is the implications for the amount of effort that's spent on resilience. If you really are striving toward what I frankly would consider an unrealistic objective, are you going to be distracted from preparing for the inevitability that in fact that which you plan on accepting will happen? And now how do you deal with that?
I think that's a great question. We have to have as our goal to prevent this at all costs in all domains. But of course we recognize it is actually operationally day to day much more a risk management game than a risk prevention game. And it is all about resilience. We are being attacked. I wasn't attacked physically, but in the office over July 4th weekend, don't ask me why I was crazy enough to be there July 4th weekend. My computers malfunctioned. And one of my other hats is I worry about countering WMD, and at that moment we were tracking a North Korean ship that had left North Korea on the way to Burma with some bad stuff, and I kind of needed my computer. So I know what it's like firsthand. And it wasn't that the computer was blowing up, or they weren't telling me to, the message wasn't saying go bomb San Diego. It wasn't disinformation, it just wasn't working right. So, we have to be able to respond instantaneously, almost instantaneously, to stop these things, even if we get hit, and to evaluate what is being done to us so that we don't take steps that are always off in the wrong direction. But if you can just reflect a bit how malevolent this work could get, it is absolutely life-threatening if it's done in the most malevolent sort of way. So all I can say is, and I'm not an alarmist generally, and I'm not a hyper threat guy, but from what I've learned just in the 6 months I've been on the job, this is serious business.
We had a question back there, and please identify yourself.
I'm glad to hear that. I have many of them.
I have just a parochial, maybe a quick question. Wondering if you're taking advantage of or working with my old boss, Andy Marshall, in the Office of Net Assessment. They do a lot of global strategic work, as you know.
Absolutely. Well, Andy is the cosmic thinker for the department. He came here temporarily in 1973. I asked him when I joined the department, I've known him for a long time, was he still thinking it over? And he said he was still thinking it over, but looked good. So yes, of course, we're in touch. He's commissioned some studies, and he's always 6 steps ahead of everyone else in these issues. So we'd be really foolish not to take advantage of such a creative capability that we have right down the hall from us.
We have time for one more quick question, if there is one. Please, in the back here.
Okay. Thanks, sir. My name is Jiang from Radio Free Asia in Washington. At your question that you mentioned about the North Korea shortly, a couple of months ago there was just some issue about the North Korea's cyber attack to the South Korea or the United States something. So can you tell me briefly what do you think about the North Korea's cyber attack capability, and any comment on that, please?
I think it's developing. I think we have to be very careful before we attribute a particular attack to a particular government. It's trickier to absolutely have total confidence or very, very high confidence than one might think. And even if others are quick to conclude it was a particular government, we have to, I think, be a bit more careful before we come to the same conclusion. And we found in looking at a number of these cyber attacks, the Estonian attack, which you discussed this morning, the Georgia attack, there have been other attacks in Europe, the role of some of our Asian friends. It takes a while, and that's part of the problem. It takes a while to trace back and understand, the ultimate source. And, we're getting to the point of technologies which can conceal the source and deceive us of the source. So we have to be very careful. But do they have a growing cyber capability? Yes. Is it part of their growing military, national security arsenal to hold on to their regime? Absolutely.
Dr. Nacht, on behalf of everyone here, let me thank you for not only taking the time, but let me also leave you with a little token of our appreciation, figuratively and literally something.
Is there some special chip embedded in this thing?
Exactly. It's our coin. Is that you're suggesting your coins are chipped? But I'd like to thank you so much for taking the All right, you can join us here for a couple. Now we've got a great panel to be able to build on many of the discussion we heard not only from Dr. Nacht, but also earlier this morning on the threat panel. We're starting off with Martin Libicki. I've had the privilege of working with Martin for many years, and I'm delighted to see he has continued to plug away in the cyber environment. And I think his most recent report on cyber deterrence and cyber warfare is one of the must-reads. So if you haven't read it, I suggest you pick it up and do read it. Following Martin, we have another friend and colleague for a number of years, Captain Dick O'Neill. Dick was overseeing strategy and plans for the then Assistant Secretary of Defense for C3I. He was a founder of the Highlands Forum, which I think is one of the most creative groups inside Washington that brings together, much like we strive, very multi- and interdisciplinary perspectives to look at a common set of issues. So thank you, Dick, for joining. And following Dick, we have Terry Pudas from the National Defense University. He's done a major study himself on cyber deterrence, and I think I highly recommend that everyone pick that up. He's currently with the Center for Technology and National Security Policy, and also comes to us from OSD, and prior to that served in the Navy as well. And finally, we have an old friend, Lee Zeichner, whom I first worked closely with during President Clinton's Presidential Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. Lee, I think, is, in terms of the legal field, knows how to bring all of these disciplines together and distill them in a way that both lawyers and practitioners and the policy wonks understand. Lee is also an author of a must-read book, Cybersecurity and Corporate Liability, which serves as a guide. If I can ask the group, unfortunately we have to be even briefer than I would hope, because we want to make sure that Senator Collins has some time to speak. So, Martin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I hesitate to follow Dr. Nacht's brilliant remarks, but if I hesitate too long, our panel is going to run too late. So let me sort of just jump into this. I want to talk a little bit about attribution. Attribution is not the only problem in cyber deterrence, but it's the one that everybody comes up with first, and I want to make a couple remarks about that. Attribution is commonly understood to be necessary for deterrence. It is not 100% necessary. If you're fans of having a cyber doomsday machine, I guess it doesn't matter who hits you first. But that's probably not a realistic scenario for the United States. And so attribution in all practical sense is important. Now, I want to make a small distinction here. Attribution from a legal point of view asks the question, who did it? But attribution from the policy point of view is a slightly different question, and that is, who can stop it? And so some of the distinctions we make between, well, did country X do it, or did they have their citizens do it, may be irrelevant if we, through our deterrence policy, can persuade such a country not to have its citizens do it. But that depends on the relationship between those in the country who did it and the government itself. Okay, when you do attribution, there are three parties you have to address. You have to address your own uncertainties. If what you're contemplating in return is public, that is known by the rest of the world, to a certain extent you have to persuade the rest of the world. But you also have to a certain extent, persuade the attacker. Now, that would seem to be a paradox because the attacker knows that he did it, right? But the attacker may not be convinced that you know he did it. I'll give you an example. There is a cyber attack by Iran. The usual time required for attribution takes place. We concluded that Iran did it, okay? We announce that we're going to do something back. Iran sits back and thinks, okay, we did it, but I'm not sure that they know we did it. However, I do know that they don't like us very much. So their threat to hit us back isn't going to deter us from doing a cyber. It's going to try to persuade us not to be who we are, and that's unacceptable. So to a certain extent, when you're doing attribution, there has to be at least some communication, some way of convincing the fellows who did it that we, in fact, knew who did it. Okay. How do we do attribution? Mostly by tracing things back. That's how we do it today. Well, under the current circumstances, we find a bunch of attackers who don't fear the consequences very much and who really don't practice very good tradecraft, which is to say they tend to launch attacks from either devices that they own, in some cases, or devices that are in the same country. That's largely because attribution doesn't have much in the way of consequences. As bad as attribution is now, if in fact getting caught had consequences, you can imagine a tradecraft would get better. There are so many ways to launch an attack not to be visible from your own country. I'm just going to enumerate them quickly. One is to use multi-hop. Another is to use what are called onion routers, which are basically institutionalized multi-hop. You can have your own agent sit at some cafe somewhere, some public library with open internet access. You can basically suborn a computer. In other words, you can turn it into a bot and have it relay your attacks. You can find an open Wi-Fi connection and hijack the connection for an attack. And finally, and I'm not certain you can do it this year, but you'll be able to do it fairly soon, is do it over a cell phone. I see two computing devices here to my right and to my left which have computer-like capabilities. They happen to be called iPods. Those capabilities are becoming much more ubiquitous. All you have to do is buy one of those devices, get yourself a prepaid cell phone card, be careful not to use it too often, and don't call your friends on these devices, and voila, you are virtually untraceable. Okay? What are another criteria we do? As Latin, it's called the cui bono test. In other words, who benefits? In whose interest was it to carry out an attack? Often that's reliable. If word gets out, however, that that's our primary method of attribution, you'll find, and I don't know how to translate this in the Latin, what are called false flag attacks. In other words, in a situation where country X would be the logical one to carry out an attack, all of a sudden country not X or anti-X carries out the attack, and if you react as if it were country X, you couldn't make country anti-X's day happier. Okay? Another method, which is a little sneakier, is to rely on some knowledge of who exactly carried out the attack. Just as you could tell what Shakespeare wrote by the kind of words he used, you can sometimes tell whose attack it is by the kind of techniques they use. You have to be a little careful there. I don't know how much semantic content there is in an attack. That's going to vary. Also, if Jim Lewis is correct, the attack method you use is probably, and it's something you bought, you'll end up fingering not the attacker, but the fellow who sold you those tools, which may not be a bad thing entirely, but it doesn't necessarily get you the attacker. Finally, there's human, of which no more need be said, at least by me. Okay? What we may find out in practice is that, as they said in Watergate, it wasn't the crime, it was the stonewalling. In other words, you get in trouble not by carrying out the cyber attack, but by doing one of two things: bragging about it in which case you're basically retaliating not for the attack but for the effrontery of claiming the attack. And the other one is stonewalling if you do one of those attacks that allows our FBI to go in and say, okay, can we trace this back? And you say no. And you say, okay, well, you're not being very cooperative here. Maybe you have something to hide. And that becomes one of the two routes in. Now, if you're up against an attacker, and it's not what you call an existential matter, the problem is, in many of these regards, is that you can't single out a country and as it were, put it on the docket, because in our relationships with countries, we have many, many concerns. Let us say, and I will actually use the name of a country, China. We don't want these guys to do quite as much cyber espionage as we think they do. But we also want them to do a lot of other things, keep North Korea under control, buy our debt, contribute to environmental issues. And so in our relationship with China, we have to weigh our discomfort at their cyber espionage with a lot of other considerations. And it may not necessarily come out on top. Finally, I want to mention that you don't need 100% certainty because literally you don't take other countries to the docket. But if you're not going to have 100% certainty, you have to have a certain tolerance for making mistakes. And so you actually have to weigh one against the other. It's a matter sometimes of doing probabilities. It's a tricky art. It's not necessarily going to get easier next year or the year after. Incidentally, the RAND book that is fairly easy to find, it's available free for downloading on PDF. The trick is to look for the word cyber deterrence as one word. We have some interesting editing conventions at RAND, which made me do it that way. At that point, it should be fairly easy to find. And I'm done.
Thank you.
So I hope I didn't run too long.
Frank asked me to discuss what we should be talking about in a strategic setting a few years out. But really to do that, I wanted to step back in time a little bit to 15 years ago when I first started at OSD, thinking about some of these things. When Secretary Perry came to us one day with Barry Horton and Andy Marshall and said, we would like you to start thinking about the future of conflict in an information setting. He didn't say war, he didn't say combat, he said conflict. And what he was talking about was security writ large. And I think he had a vision at that time, actually, of the kinds of things that were available off the shelf that were going to make lots of competitors possible and make a networked world a different kind of a setting that we should be thinking about. The problem was that we did all the tabletop games. We paid for a lot of exercises. We had studies and books written, some of the best that still exist, coming out from Martin and his other co-authors, John Arquilla, David Ronfelt, and others at RAND. They still are, I think, are maybe among the best out there. But what we found was that there's a tendency to want to divert to something simple, to conceptualize a very complex problem in a simple way. And we were stuck with these concepts, and we still are to an extent. We looked at things like the metaphors, the digital Pearl Harbor. We've already heard that discussion this morning. It's not the digital Pearl Harbor, but we were stuck with that for a long time. And so all the intellectual wrapping that went around that in the arguments always referred back to that reverentially, So the other one was the template. If it was good enough for the Cold War and deterrence worked in the Cold War and it was strategic, then it must be a good template to lay over the top of what it is we're considering now. And frankly, these ideas were self-limiting. They kept us from thinking about this as a different way of addressing security writ large in this new world. So what we decided to do over especially the last 5 years in the Highlands Forum that's sponsored by the Secretary of Defense and particularly championed on these topics by the Undersecretaries for Policy, Intelligence, and the Assistant Secretary for NI Squared, was to look at different ways of addressing this particular issue of cyber or information warfare, as we called it at the time, which again, another self-limiting concept, to try to find a way of addressing it differently. So we don't have the answers for you yet, but we're sort of working at what we think are better ways of thinking about these problems, or at least more broadly thinking about them in newer ways that aren't quite so self-limiting. The group that really I would call out most significantly here consisted of Danny Kahneman, who's the Nobel Prize winner for his work on prospect theory, or decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Goldman Sachs Managing Director and Chief Information Risk Officer Phil Venables, who I'll talk about in a second, Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, Joe Nye, Kim Taple, who writes a lot about resilience and risk, and probably most importantly, Jeff Cooper of SAIC, who's here today. And Jeff's been writing a great deal about these concepts as they've been emerging, and he's probably, I think, the best author on this that's available right now. I don't want to take too much from Jeff because he's going to address some of these topics this afternoon, but I do want to at least lay markers down for a couple of things so that Jeff can maybe expand on these things. We needed to find constructs that accounted for private sector understanding as well. The point's been made that a lot of this infrastructure is in private sector hands, and they deal in this world every minute of every day. So how that played out, as well as other nations, whether it were partners, allies, competitors, we needed to think about this in a different way. And this is really a set of complex, or what is known as wicked problems. As you interact with these complex problems, you change the problem yet again. So they're very, very difficult to consider. And Jim Lewis pointed out earlier today that we really have very weak methodologies here. So the notion was looking at newer methodologies, trying to get some strength behind these things, and to try to find a way to get a level of understanding and study of networks first, and then legal frameworks, because the legal always seems to follow some years behind the technology or the change, and particularly in these social networks. So what transpired? What we looked at was the nature of relationships interlocking a networked and information world, and we had to reconsider the structures describing conflict. So what we've looked at for 50 years or more, a lot more actually, but going back to the nuclear era framework, is peace, crisis, war. And the peace, crisis, war is really a very discrete set of states, linear, and you're probably in one state at a time. And often, not always, but often leading to kinetic results, which is not necessarily the best state to be in. So with a lot of help from the group that I mentioned, the thinking started moving us into another analytic approach, not replacing peace, crisis, and war, but certainly recognizing the differences between those conditions and conditions in a network and information age. And those were states of cooperation, competition, and conflict. And conflict can mean war, but it also can mean very, very different kinds of things. And they're non-discrete, they're non-linear, and you can find yourself in 2 or 3 of those states simultaneously with the same actor. So you could make the case, as we've heard about China with cyber attacks, whether they're governmental or whether they are patriotic hackers, surrogates, that you're in all 3 states simultaneously with China. And yet, what we find is the less kinetic, the better in these kinds of states, in this kind of world, these networks. So the ability to be able to find new tools to be able to emerge from these conflict states, or these states that we want to extricate ourselves from, probably are better than some of the tools that we would have, incoming, yes, for you, Mark. That we would be able to find ways to extricate ourselves from, say, peace, crisis, war, if we could move that down to this other layer of thought. So that was the first one. We thought that it allowed for greater possibilities that Michael Nacht mentioned, the ability to address these possibilities. So what do we do with that? Well, when we looked at the private sector, they gave us a series of ideas to address deterrence then. How would a company like Goldman Sachs, for example, address deterrence? And they are in this networked world. They have as clients U.S. interests, but also the Chinese government. They play in this world every day. And so they see the information flows across their networks, and they have to deal because these people are their clients. So it's not like they're going to go to the FBI about something that China is doing, but they have to consider at what point do we go to somebody else. Cooperation, competition, conflict really reflects a Goldman point of view as well here. So what do they think about? Well, they have 4 areas, and I think Jeff will probably mention these as well. First, if you're going to look at deterrence in that kind of a framework, first would be a penalty for the attacker, whether it's retaliation, financial constraint, jail time, something like that. Second would be futility. Futility is if you make it economically difficult for someone to attack you because you're secure, or as Suzanne mentioned, the keyword resilient, then you have a greater chance at deterrence. Third is dependency. And dependency recognizes, by the way, those states of cooperation, competition, conflict, because of the notion of complex interlocking of networks in the world that we inhabit. The world of not just governments, but of private sector, of individuals sitting at their desks, as Michael was on July the 4th. You have a lot of different relationships and roles that you play at different times. And so the notion of dependency between us and attackers comes to bear. Some nation states may be our clients, as I mentioned in Goldman Sachs' case. Certainly China is a client as well as it's a client or a competitor cooperative state with us. But if they depend on us, will they seek to attack us? That's a critical question to ask. Finally, as Phil mentions in his listing, is counterproductivity. And this can take the shape of anything from public outrage after an attack to any other form of backlash. And you have to ask, can that work against an attacker strongly enough to deter them? And this relates back to Jim Lewis's categories of thresholds as well. If you can play off in a multidimensional way, cooperation, competition, conflict, these ways of thinking about engaging with one of your competitors on that list or on that spectrum, then there are other ways of approaching this. This is particularly true in the two categories that Jim mentioned first of espionage and crime. And those are where we find ourselves most often. That's where we need legal frameworks. And so I think that we need to just move out of strictly looking at security writ narrow and security writ large to embrace a different way of approaching competitors. It also allows for us to have collective security and for third parties perhaps to leverage where we have no traction at all with somebody who might be an attacker on us. So this level of usage of other actors, whether it's outside of government or outside the United States, in ways of creating a new form of deterrence, I think is probably a better way of thinking about it than perhaps some of the metaphors that we've been using that have trapped us in a very narrow construct.
Thank you, Dick. Terry.
Thank you. So I see we have 2 minutes for Lee and I to share here, right? Anyway, thanks for inviting me to this conference. I mean, it's really exciting to see how many people are here. I mean, 2.5 years ago, when I was still in OSD, I was asked to start thinking about cyber deterrence, and to be quite frank, I couldn't find more than a dozen people to have a conversation with. They're all in this room, by the way, Mark. But anyway, so I was asked in a letter I received to touch on necessity, policy issues, attribution, operational concepts, and finally, I've got a couple thoughts on what might help us get off the starting line here. I think the basic question is still out there: how big a deal is this? Okay, I mean, if you go to DOD, they'll say, look, we have all these thousands of attacks. We spent $100 million over a 6-month period to mitigate this, and we rely on this for power projection. Industry has literally hundreds and thousands of intrusions. Lots of data is exfiltrated. The financial industry, of course, there's more money made in cybercrime now than in drugs, so that's a pretty big deal. But if I go out on the street here and I ask the first person I run into, how big a deal is this? They're going to say, I'm really concerned, but nothing's really happened yet. Okay, they haven't had that Estonian life-changing experience. We know that terrorism is bad, but we haven't had that cyber event that's really put us over the edge here. And I like Dick's construct, and I was going to mention it, this notion of the complexity we live in today and this globalized, interdependent, very brittle construct where we're not only trying to compete, we're trying to collaborate, and these are people that we're competing with for global influence and stature. Okay, so just a couple key points on some of these other issues. People are referring to this as sort of the newest of the global commons, this sort of never land. I'm not sure that that's all correct. I mean, there are some areas, and I just read Jim's new piece, and I agree with some of that. At the end of the day, the activity begins at some keyboard and some box, and it has a physical location, and it does have sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, I mean, this notion that it's just this big cloud out there, I quite frankly don't buy. Issues with policy barriers, declaratory policies, all of those sorts of things. Clearly, this is hampered by this notion of understanding what a threshold is, credible and demonstrated retaliatory capability. We're playing poker with all our cards on the table, okay? Just believe us, we've got some aces here, and if you do something, we're going to flip those aces over. Well, maybe and maybe not, okay? So we've got to move beyond the bluff stage, I think, here. And then, of course, this is all complicated because even if you do get attribution, you've got to go through the calculus of geopolitical intent, which I think some of the other speakers talked about. And then everybody from the intel community is going to say, well, wait a minute, there's an intel gain-loss part of this calculus. Maybe we really don't want to let this be known. So those are things that sort of complicate that And of course, this notion of threshold, what constitutes the use of force, and I like the Estonian ambassador, or Minister of Defense's construct is we need to leave that open to some interpretation in some way. I mean, even if you look at our national response framework, you'll see that the cyber incident annex describes it as an incident of national significance. Okay, so we can determine what that is when we get there. One of the recent events that I did a few months ago, one of the things, we're not doing anything. We're not being active, and so as a result, it's very, very difficult to roll back or deter this notion of industrial espionage. We set new norms and thresholds every day that we don't do something. He talked about the Article 4, Article 5 piece, so I won't talk about that. I do want to talk a little bit about this notion of the public-private sector and the collaboration and cooperation that's going to be required. And I think we have some impediments there, both culturally and policy-wise. Many people I talk to in the private sector would say, we really want to collaborate with the government. We'd like to invite them in. We'd like to share, have them look around. Everybody knows what adverse discovery is, right? Okay, so we invite the government in. We say, ooh, this is a problem. No problem. We'll create a regulation and we'll solve this on the spot. Okay? I'm not sure that that's the way we want to go. Of course, there's litigation. If you're in a financial industry and you know that it's made public that X amount of dollars are skimmed off the top every night in electronic funds transfers, and you have your money in that bank, you may say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to go put my money in another bank that's safer, and so you lose market share and consumer confidence. Okay, so now I've listed all the same issues everybody else has, so let me try to put forward a couple of potential solutions. It's not clear to me that we understand the real nature of the problem, okay? And by that I mean explicitly and quantifiably be able to articulate what does this mean that I have all these intrusions in my networks. I think I have this much data has been exfiltrated. So if I'm the senior decision maker in OSD, I'll say, got it. Okay, so what? What does that mean to me in terms of operational risk? Okay, if I'm in the industry, I'll say, got it, that's really interesting, so what? Okay, what does that mean in terms of my market competitiveness and bottom line on the quarterly earnings statement? Okay, so until we can really get to that intellectual level of sophistication, I think we're going to have a hard time of generating sort of a sense of urgency a little bit. Public awareness campaign. The Estonians have it right. Of course, they've had this life-changing experience. I think we just went through Cyber Security Awareness Month, I think. Not clear. I learned a lot about healthcare reform, but I'm not sure how much I learned about cybersecurity. I don't mean to be cynical about that, but are we safer this month than we were last month? Okay. Clearly, we got to start at first principles, and that's building the intellectual base. Okay, that's just not throwing money at it. That's starting at K through 12 education, working on all those issues. The Estonians have a great model. Okay, and then we don't necessarily have to become a victim of the future. We could participate, develop a strategy to interact with these private international consortiums that are developing protocols and internet architectures, and at a senior level in a way that promotes identity and helps limit anonymity. So I think there's actually some things you can do there. And perhaps explore legislation that creates sort of this safe space for this public-private conversation. I know in the run-up to Y2K, there was some proposed legislation. It was sort of like indemnification kind of stuff where you would limit liability. I don't know if that's the model, but doing nothing is not the right answer either. So let's see. Okay, and one last one, concept of operations. I agree with Jim that offense now dominates defense. Typically, whenever that's happened, we've moved our thinking more towards the source of the activity. Okay, out beyond the perimeter. Okay, limits the lines of advance. It's actually more effective and more efficient. I'm not trying to arm wave away the problems with that because there are authorities and capabilities and all kinds of issues that go along with that. But I think we're compelled to start thinking in that direction. So with that, I'll quit. I think I went over.
Lee.
Frank, I think I have about 60 seconds. I'll do my best. Frank, thank you, and HSPI. This is the first time I'm aware of a very serious effort to start defining these incredibly important principles in law and policy. Frankly, when you called, I was thinking back on my Sunday school education. We spent years studying the Torah. I'm Jewish, and we spent just as much time studying Genesis, 2 years, as we did Chronicles 1 and 2, 2 years. And what I took from that lesson learned is that naming matters. It's very important to start naming and defining because it provides you a foundation, a long-term foundation on which to build. But in order to do that, I think that part of the reason why we spend an enormous amount of time dancing around problems is that we don't go at root cause issues. We don't address the impediments that really stop us from naming from Capitol Hill what our law and policy framework is going to look like, and I think it matters. So what I'll do in about 30 seconds is just list 3 impediments that I think deserve a lot more thought. The first is our tendency to graft very important new foundation legislative principles on old legislative foundations. To put this in business terms, our business model is 19th century to address this problem on Capitol Hill. In order to do that, I would look at one law as an example of just how dangerous it is to graft, which is the Defense Production Act. I was a big proponent of Senator Bennett from the Banking Committee amending definitions of national defense to include cyber deterrence principles, which he did in 2003. And so if you go into the statutes and read the Defense Production Act, you'll see that Congress has amended an extraordinarily important 60-year-old statute to include cyber protection and restoration. The problem is, first, it came out of the Banking Committee, and second, the core of the Defense Production Act is really all about World War II and rationing, and I'm just not sure that that provides an appropriate foundation. So we need to talk about that impediment. Where do the new principles come from? The second is when we do graft, we don't graft appropriately. If you look at President Obama's emergency declaration with regard to H1N1, you'll see that he doesn't need a cyber statute to do that. The Public Health Service Act provides an extraordinarily powerful legislative and administrative foundation, 60 years of relationships across government and the healthcare community to address emergency conditions. We can look at the Bank Secrecy Act, we can look at the Communications Act. There's all sorts of laws in each of the different sectors that Congress perhaps should be grafting onto to provide a cyber deterrence foundation. And I think the root cause problem there is we're just not exactly sure how to graft with the new committee structure on the Hill. And then finally, I'll conclude with the private sector impediment, and I just want to reverberate what Jim Lewis has been talking about. Let's learn from the TARP. Very large private sector corporations provide the backbone of our economy. They're distributed, they have relationships, and from a cyber perspective, they're too big to fail. The policy problem that we in government and industry grapple with is the same problem that folks in the TARP are grappling with, which is how do you confer a benefit to very large private sector corporations? It's not fair. It goes against our consumer protection policy. But quite frankly, given the realities of the marketplace, I think we have to. But that's an impediment, and I think that we need to come to terms with that impediment before we're going to be able to stand on the mountain and state with absolute clarity what our law and policy is. Frank, I'll turn it back to you.
Lee, thank you. This was, again, a very rich discussion. I think we're getting some greater clarity and focus on what it is we're all grappling and trying to get our arms around. And I think Dr. Nacht also highlighted many of those issues from the OSD perspective that are still unanswered questions. We are a little behind schedule, but have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I want to make sure that we, as with all of these topics, they transcend all of what we've discussed. So I think we have the benefit of having many of the speakers here, but we are already 10 minutes over in terms of time. So if there are any burning questions, please raise your hand. If not, we can pick up some of those discussions in the next panel, since there actually is some time in between lunch and then. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you. This was great, and I think we're moving closer. So thank you all for taking the time.